Hi, I'm Stefanie Reher, and I'll be talking about some of my research from a project on voter evaluations of disabled candidates. And here I'm specifically looking at how voters' own political preferences influence their propensity to vote for disabled candidates. There are about 1 billion people around the world who live with a disability. That's around 50% of the world's population, but in the UK, general estimates are more around 20%. So that's, in either case, a very large group in society. And at the same time, it's a group that's quite strongly underrepresented in politics. So even though we lack official statistics, there's widespread agreement that the number is much lower than it would be if it was representative of the public. And in the House of Commons at the moment, there are only around 5 MPs who are generally known to be disabled. There might, of course, be a few more who might have hidden or invisible disabilities. What might cause this descriptive or numerical underrepresentation? Research based on interviews with disabled candidates and representatives points to a number of barriers across the political recruitment process, including issues of accessibility in terms of buildings, procedures, and so on, financial issues and a lack of financial support to pay for reasonable adjustments, and also an ableist political culture, including within parties. A factor that's, of course, difficult to gauge from these interviews is the potential role of public attitudes. It could be that citizens are less willing to support disabled candidates at the ballot box because they might have prejudices or expectations that these candidates might not be able to fulfill their tasks of public office. Or there might be indirect effects as well of parties failing to nominate disabled candidates because they might fear such public backlash. We do know that candidate characteristics matter to voters. So among the many shortcuts that voters rely on when evaluating candidates in elections, they also rely on stereotypes about the social groups that candidates belong to evaluate their traits, beliefs, and competences. And there's evidence for this for female, Black and minority ethnic politicians, or for instance, with regard to the parental status of candidates. We also know that mediated by these assumptions about candidates' traits, beliefs, and competences, candidate characteristics and identities also affect voter support at the ballot box. So the question is then, does candidate disability also affect voter support? There's some reason to suspect that it might, because there are predominantly negative stereotypes about disabled people in society that are quite pervasive. Disabled people tend to be seen as incompetent, dependent, weak, vulnerable, characteristics that are generally not desirable in politicians. They're also shown to have discomfort, fear, pity, and as a result, avoidant behaviors towards disabled people. And the question is, does that also travel to the political sphere? But at the same time, there's also a very different image of disabled people that we're often confronted with. That's an image which we often see in pop culture, in the media, for instance, of disabled people being very inspiring, heroic, courageous for having overcome the obstacles that they face in society, and for having accomplished sort of extraordinary achievements. This image is often called that of the supercrip in the disability studies literature. In addition to that, voters might assume that because of the experience of barriers and adversity that most disabled people have had, they might be more empathetic towards other people in society experiencing hardship for various reasons. And as a result, they might be more likely to support them. So it could be the case that disabled politicians are not so much seen in light of the general negative stereotypes about disabled people, but instead constitute a subtype of disabled people with quite contrary and rather positive stereotypes attached to them. So based on these kind of contradictory expectations that we have here, I hypothesize that voters are not more or less likely to vote for disabled than for non-disabled candidates. I then look at voters' ideology and whether that influences how they perceive and to what extent they support disabled candidates as compared to non-disabled candidates. Specifically, my expectation is that because left-wing ideology is sort of by definition associated with stronger support for egalitarian values, that it might also be associated with a stronger preference for including underrepresented and marginalized groups, such as disabled people in politics. In addition to that, previous research from the same project has shown that voters tend to perceive disabled candidates as more compassionate and more concerned about issues such as social welfare, minority rights, healthcare, and also as more left-wing. So based on that, I expect that more left-wing voters will perceive disabled candidates as more congruent with their own political views and as more likely to represent their own views, and are therefore also more likely to vote for them. So to summarize, I hypothesize that more left-wing voters are more likely to vote for disabled candidates, and that this is partly due to, first of all, a stronger preference for the inclusion of underrepresented groups, and the perceived left-wing ideology of disabled candidates as compared to non-disabled candidates. To test these hypotheses, I conducted a survey experiment among a sample of the UK population in May and June of last year. The design was a paired conjoint design where respondents see descriptions of two fictional candidates with a set of attributes or characteristics that are randomly assigned. So here we see all the different attributes, including gender, profession, experience in politics, and so on. And then importantly, also disability. So candidates are described as either being blind, being deaf, or being paraplegic, or there's no disability mentioned at all in 40% of the cases. Here you see an example of what respondents would see. So here are the descriptions of two candidates, candidate A and B, and candidate A is paralyzed below the waist and uses a wheelchair to get around, whereas candidate B is blind and reads using text-to-speech software. So for the deaf candidate, they will be primarily communicating in British Sign Language and have interpreters. Importantly, all the other characteristics here are also randomly assigned, which means that I can identify the effect of candidate disability across all the different values of the other characteristics. So across male and female candidates, candidates of different ages, and so on. So let's look at the results. In terms of the first hypothesis, we see that the paraplegic candidate is slightly more likely to receive voter support than the non-disabled candidate. So what we see here is the average marginal component effect, and positive coefficients mean stronger support, electoral support for the disabled candidate as opposed to the non-disabled candidate. So while we see this positive effect here for the paraplegic candidates, we don't see any effect for the blind or deaf candidate. So overall, it seems that voters seem to be slightly more likely to support disabled candidates, at least candidates with a mobility impairment. But overall, it seems that there is no strong effect of candidate disability on voter support. Now, what about voters at different positions of the ideological spectrum? Here we see the coefficients of supporting each of the disabled candidates versus the non-disabled candidates for voters along the left-right spectrum here. And we see that left-wing voters generally are more likely to support disabled candidates versus a non-disabled candidate than right-wing voters. And we see that when it comes to the deaf candidate and the paraplegic candidate, they're even more likely to support the disabled candidate than the non-disabled candidate. Whereas for the right-wing voters, we see that the coefficients here are negative all the way to the right, but they're not statistically significant. However, we do see quite strong effects of voter ideology here. Now, how can we explain them? So in black, we see the mechanism that I just tested, the effect of candidate disability on electoral support moderated by voter ideology. And what I then tested through a mediation analysis is, first of all, whether candidate disability leads to perceived left-wing ideology, and whether candidate disability leads to a perceived ability to represent underrepresented groups. And what I found was that is the case with regard to all three disability types. I then tested whether more left-wing voters are more likely to support candidates that are perceived as more left-wing, and whether more left-wing voters are more likely to support candidates that are perceived as better able to represent underrepresented groups. So that's this part of the causal mechanism. And again, here we see that that is the case. So these effects and interactions are statistically significant in the cases of all three disability types. Now, when we include these mechanisms in the model, the blue one and the red one here, the proposed causal mechanisms, what happens to this direct effect of candidate disability on electoral support? What we see here is that it disappears, right? So we hardly see any effect of candidate disability on voter support. And we also see hardly any difference here between left-wing and more right-wing voters. So to conclude, across the electorate, candidate disability doesn't really decrease voter support at all. If anything, there's a positive effect, at least for some impairments, in this case, the mobility impairment, and the next step will be also to include a larger variety of different impairment types. There is strong evidence for variation between voters, and specifically left-wing voters are more supportive of disabled candidates due to closer perceived congruence and a preference for minority group representation. And these are results that are also likely to travel to other identities and characteristics of candidates. These fairly positive or optimistic sort of conclusions when it comes to candidate disability are very much in line with the previous analysis I conducted in this project on perceived traits, beliefs, and competences, where also disabled candidates tended to be perceived as stronger or more positive, if anything. This analysis also suggests that voter prejudice is actually unlikely to be a key reason for the underrepresentation of disabled people in politics, because they don't seem to discriminate against disabled politicians, at least not when we look across the ideological spectrum. Unless, however, the fear of such punishment still affects the likelihood of parties' electorates to support prospective candidates who are disabled. But knowledge of the lack of such punishment by voters might, of course, change that behavior as well. Thank you for watching my presentation, and I look forward to any comments or feedback that you might have.